In the summer of 430 BCE, a young Athenian soldier stood guard on the walls of his city. He was healthy, strong, and confident. Then, without warning, he dropped his spear, clutched his head, and collapsed. Within days, he was dead. His was one of the first recorded cases of what would later be called the Plague of Athens. The disease spread like wildfire through the crowded city, packed with refugees from the countryside. People died in the streets, in temples, and in their own homes. The historian Thucydides, who survived the plague himself, left a detailed account of its symptoms: fever, redness of the eyes, violent coughing, and a terrible thirst that drove sufferers to throw themselves into rainwater. Thucydides noted that those who recovered gained immunity and could care for the sick. But the social fabric unraveled. Fear of the plague led to lawlessness. People stopped fearing the gods or human laws. The city's leader, Pericles, gave a famous funeral speech honoring the dead, but he himself fell to the plague in 429 BCE. Athens never fully recovered, and its defeat in the Peloponnesian War. Modern historians and scientists have debated the cause of the Plague of Athens for centuries. Typhoid fever, typhus, smallpox, and Ebola have all been suggested. Recent DNA analysis of teeth from a mass grave in Athens found evidence of Salmonella enterica serovar typhi, the bacterium that causes typhoid fever. But the debate continues. The Plague of Athens remains a mystery, a reminder of how disease can deaths in a catastrophe that would kill perhaps 1/3 of Athens' population. This was the Plague of Athens, and it changed the world. The Plague of Athens struck during the Peloponnesian War, a brutal conflict between Athens and Sparta. The historian Thucydides, who survived the plague himself, described in vivid detail: people in good health were all of a sudden attacked by violent heats in the head, and redness and inflammation in the eyes, the throat and tongue becoming bloody and emitting an unnatural and fetid breath. The symptoms were gruesome, and the disease spread rapidly through the crowded city. The crowded conditions of Athens, with refugees from the countryside packed inside the city walls, created a perfect breeding ground for the plague. People died in the streets, temples, and even in their own homes. The social order began to collapse as fear and desperation. Thucydides himself fell ill but recovered. His account remains one of the earliest and most detailed descriptions of a pandemic in history. The Plague of Athens not only devastated the city's population, but also weakened its military power, contributing to its eventual defeat by Sparta. In chilling detail, victims suffered fever, red eyes, throat ulcers, and an insatiable thirst. Many died within a week. The plague devastated Athens' military and morale. It killed their great leader Pericles, and with him the city's strategic vision. Athens lost the war and the golden age of Athens came to an end. The Peloponnesian War dragged on for another decade, but Athens never recovered its strength. Sparta eventually won, but the victory was hollow. The war had exhausted all of Greece. City-states turned inward, fighting among themselves. The Persian Empire saw its chance and reasserted control over the Greek cities of Asia Minor. The classical era was fading. But the story of Greece was not over. A new power was rising to the north, Macedon. Under King Philip II, Macedon had transformed from a backward kingdom into a military powerhouse. Philip reorganized the army, introduced the long Sarissa pike, and used diplomacy and bribery as effectively as battle. He began to unite the Greek city-states under his rule, not by conquest alone, but by persuasion. By 338 BC, Philip had defeated the combined armies of Athens and Thebes at the Battle of Chaeronea. Greece was now under Macedonian control. Philip planned to invade the Persian Empire, but he was assassinated in 336 BC. The task fell to his son, a young man of 20, Alexander. He would not just invade Persia, he would tear. Greek democracy collapsed. Centuries later, another forgotten epidemic struck the Roman Empire. The Antonine Plague, likely smallpox, began in 165 CE when Roman troops returned from the east. It raged for 15 years, killing millions, including Emperor Lucius Verus. The empire's armies were decimated, trade routes collapsed, and the empire never fully recovered. The plague returned in waves, weakening Rome's borders. By the 3rd century, barbarian tribes pushed in from all sides. The Roman army, once invincible, now struggled to hold the line. The economy faltered, cities shrank, and the great imperial machine began to stall. Then came the plague of Justinian in 541 CE. This time, the culprit was Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that would cause the Black Death centuries later. It swept through the Byzantine Empire, killing up to 25 million people in its first wave. Constantinople lost perhaps half its population. The Emperor Justinian himself fell ill, though he survived. The plague returned in cycles for over 2 centuries, crippling the Byzantine Empire at its peak. Trade ground to a halt, tax revenues dried up, and the army could no longer defend its borders. The great project of reconquering the old Roman Empire collapsed. Justinian's dream died, and a new dark age settled over Europe. The economy faltered. The plague exposed the fragility of Rome's vast interconnected system. It was the beginning of a long decline that would eventually lead to the fall of the West. In 541 CE, the plague of Justinian swept through the Byzantine Empire. It was the first recorded outbreak. The plague spread along trade routes, carried by rats and fleas on grain ships from Egypt. Constantinople, the capital, was hit especially hard. At its peak, the plague killed up to 5,000 people per day in Constantinople alone. Bodies were piled in towers or dumped into mass graves. Of bubonic plague, at its peak, it killed up to 5,000 people per day in Constantinople alone. Emperor Justinian himself fell ill but survived. The plague wiped out perhaps half of Europe's population, crippling the empire's ability to defend its borders. It allowed the rise of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula, as the weakened Byzantine and Persian empires could no longer project power into the region. The plague also caused labor shortages, leading to economic decline and social unrest across the Mediterranean. The plague returned in waves for another 2 centuries, each time sapping the empire's strength. By the 7th century, the Roman Empire in the East was a shadow of its former self, reduced to a fraction of its territory and population. The Justinianic plague is a stark reminder of how disease can reshape history. It weakened the classical world and set the stage for the medieval era, a world transformed by pandemic. The following century, as weakened Byzantine and Persian empires could not resist the new force. Perhaps no epidemic changed the world as decisively as smallpox in the Americas. When Europeans arrived, they brought diseases to which Native Americans had no immunity. Smallpox, measles, and influenza killed an estimated 90% of the indigenous population in some areas, wiping out entire civilizations before they even saw a European face. The Aztec capital Tenochtitlan fell not just to Spanish swords, but to a smallpox epidemic that killed the emperor and much of the population, crippling the city's defense. In the Andes, the Inca Empire suffered a similar fate. Smallpox spread south from Central America, killing the emperor and sparking a civil war that made conquest by a handful of Spaniards possible. 90% of the indigenous population. This demographic collapse made conquest possible. The Aztec and Inca empires, with millions of people, were reduced to shadows. Hernán Cortés, with just a few hundred men, conquered the Aztecs not by sword alone, but by disease. Some historians argue that smallpox was even more decisive than the Spanish weapons. The natives had no immunity, while the Europeans carried the virus unknowingly. Entire cities were wiped out before a single battle was fought. The Spanish also brought measles, influenza, and typhus. These diseases spread like wildfire through densely populated cities like Tenochtitlan. The lack of sanitation and close quarters made the situation even worse. By the time the Spanish arrived in the Inca Empire, smallpox had already killed the emperor and much of the population. This left the empire in chaos, making it easy for Francisco Pizarro to conquer it with only 168 men. Used intentionally as a biological weapon, though evidence is debated. The 1918 influenza pandemic is often called the forgotten pandemic. It killed more people than World War I itself, an estimated 50 million worldwide. Yet it is rarely mentioned in history books. The flu spread rapidly among soldiers in crowded trenches and camps. Then the virus was unusually deadly for young adults, a demographic typically resistant to flu. Healthy soldiers in their 20s would report sick in the morning and be dead by nightfall. The Spanish flu, as it was misnamed, did not originate in Spain. Spain was neutral during the war and had no censorship, so its newspapers freely reported the outbreak, creating a false impression of origin. Public health responses varied wildly. Some cities closed schools, banned public gatherings, and required masks. Others did little. In Philadelphia, a parade to sell war bonds in September 1918 led to a massive outbreak. Within 72 hours, all 31 city hospitals were full. In contrast, St. Louis acted quickly and had half the death rate. The difference was time. The pandemic ended as mysteriously as it began. By the summer of 1919, the virus had mutated into a milder form and the world moved on. But the trauma lingered. The 1918 flu reshaped public health systems, spurred vaccine research, and left a genetic legacy that still circulates in seasonal flu strains today. It remains a warning, nature's deadliest weapon, the crowded trenches and then across the globe. It hit young adults hardest, those in their prime. The pandemic may have hastened the end of the war, as both sides were too sick to fight. It also changed medicine. It spurred global public health systems and vaccine research. But the memory of the 1918 flu faded quickly. The world wanted to forget the war and the pandemic together. The lessons were buried, only to be rediscovered a century later when another pandemic struck. Its lessons were forgotten, leading to similar mistakes in later pandemics. Not all effects of epidemics were purely destructive. The Black Death, for example, led to labor shortages that improved wages for peasants and weakened feudalism. The 1918 flu spurred the development of the WHO and modern epidemiology. Smallpox eradication stands as one of humanity's greatest achievements. Through a global vaccination campaign led by the WHO, the last natural case was recorded in 1977. This triumph proved that coordinated global action could defeat a disease. It set a precedent for future public health campaigns and inspired efforts against polio and measles. The first vaccine was born from a catastrophe. In 1796, Edward Jenner took pus from a milkmaid's cowpox sore and inoculated a young boy. The boy developed a mild illness, but was later immune to smallpox. This was the beginning of vaccination, a turning point, but the story of vaccination is also a story of resistance. In the 19th century, anti-vaccination movements emerged, fueled by distrust of government and medicine. People protested mandatory smallpox vaccination, claiming it violated personal freedom. These protests echo today's vaccine. Despite resistance, vaccines have saved millions of lives. Smallpox was declared eradicated in 1980, the first disease wiped out by human effort. Polio is nearly gone. Measles, once a common childhood killer, is now preventable. Each success came from collective action and trust in science. But the pattern of forgetting repeats. Each generation must learn the lessons anew. The COVID-19 pandemic showed both the power of rapid vaccine development and the danger of misinformation. The question remains, will we remember this time, or will history, as powerful as any army or leader? They show us that no empire is invincible, no society immune. They also reveal our resilience. The same human ingenuity that created vaccines and public health systems can prepare us for future threats. But only if we remember. The next pandemic might not be a virus at all. It could be a superbug resistant to all antibiotics, or a fungus carried by the winds of a changing climate, or a pathogen engineered in a lab, accidentally or intentionally. The threat evolves, and so must we. Are building early warning systems, global networks that track disease outbreaks in real time, genomic surveillance that can spot a new variant before it spreads, AI models that predict where the next spillover might occur. These tools is not a question of if, but when. And when it comes, we will face it not as helpless victims, but as a species that has learned from its past. We will remember the lessons written in the bones of history, and we will be ready. Is not a matter of if, but when. And the lessons of the past are our best defense. We often think of history as a story of kings, wars, and inventions. But disease has been a silent partner in every era. It has toppled empires, ended wars, and reshaped societies in ways we still feel. Consider the Black Death. In the 14th century, it swept across Europe, killing an estimated 30 to 50% of the population. Entire villages were wiped out. The social order crumbled. Labor became scarce, and peasants suddenly had bargaining power. This shift helped break the feudal system and paved the way for the Renaissance. Disease has also been a decisive factor in war. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the Americas, they brought smallpox with them. The indigenous populations had no immunity. Millions died, and the great Aztec and Inca empires fell not just to swords, but to germs. Even today, infectious diseases continue to shape our world. The 1918 influenza pandemic killed more people than World War I, and more recently, COVID-19 disrupted economies, changed how we work, and accelerated technological change. History shows that disease is a powerful force, one we ignore at our... The past is not dead, it is not even past. It lives in our immune systems, our cities, and our fears. The question is, will we listen? By remembering these forgotten epidemics, we honor the millions who died and gain the wisdom to face our own challenges. Societies. By remembering these forgotten epidemics, we honor the millions who died and gain the wisdom to face our own challenges. The past is not dead, it is not even past. It lives in our immune systems, our cities, and our fears. The question is, will we listen?